Today I'm going to present, hopefully you can see it now, I'm going to present this collaborated work with some of my former colleagues at the Max Planck and some of my new colleagues at Pompeu Fabra, and also my partner. So in a sense, this paper is the partial answer to what happens when you keep two academics apart for many, many months due to the pandemic. Well, sometimes they just end up writing a paper. So what are we going to do in this work? Well, we're going to try to assess the magnitude of the mortality impact of the pandemic. And we're going to do this in the framework of years of life lost. So the title of the presentation, I said global, it's aspirational. So we're trying to do it for as many countries as possible with a sort of common methodology and same sources of data. So it's as homogeneous as possible. We're going to be comparing the impact in terms of years of life lost to other causes of death. And I will be arguing that this is a sort of natural comorbidity adjustment. And we're going to break it down for you in terms of ages and genders. So why, well, what is it that this sort of framework can bring to the table in assessing the magnitude of the impact? So we believe that it is a good way to organize some of the discussion or conflictive narrative that we had around the magnitude of the pandemic in hopefully around evidence. So I'm just going to have some statements that we have all heard especially in the first months of the pandemic, and I'll then be answering them in terms of the YLL framework. So hopefully this will give you a sense of how this might be useful. So one of the statements that we have all heard is only the elderly and the feeble are dying. And actually, if we look at the results of our calculations, most of the years of life lost globally in the sense of our sample are not attributed to those in the oldest age group. So the deaths are, but not the years of life lost. Something else that we have also heard is that it's just like the flu. Well, according to our calculations, if we focus in those countries, obviously, that have been heavily impacted, it is much worse than even the worst flu in the last 27 years, and I'll be quantifying that. And finally, one might argue that in doing these sort of calculations, and I'll go into details in a second, we are not accounting for the fact that there is a comorbidity bias or an inflation of the years of life lost that is due simply to the fact that those who are dying have pre-existing conditions, comorbidity. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be focusing on comparisons or ratios between causes of death. So while it is true that those who died to COVID may have more pre-existing conditions, the same can be said, for example, for those who died due to the flu. Now, if we are comparing one to another, insofar as the bias or the inflation is somehow similar, then we are in fact already accounting for it in that sense. Okay, so it's not completely invalidated by the fact that there might be this comorbidity bias. Now, why did we write that paper? Well, the first version of this paper was written during the summer. Now I have updated all the figures for today's presentation, but why is it that we decided to write this paper then? Well, the reason is that three of the main limitations that existed to doing these exercises were sort of lifted by the release of certain data sets. Some of them were hosted by the Max Planck, others by some of the scientists within the Max Planck. So we had good data, good comparable data across a wide variety of countries on age and gender specific death counts due to COVID. And this is Tim and Enrique that put together this fantastic data set. Then the human mortality database released in the summer, weekly all case mortality data, publicly available and up to date, so including 2020. So in that sense, we could perform these now very common excess mortality computations. And we believe that, of course, excess mortality has played a big role. So we didn't want to write a paper without it. And finally, we had a sense of what may have happened of projected mortality had the different governments across the globe not implemented some measures. So we wanted to have that as well in the paper. And we had then these three elements that allowed us to write a paper that we could feel that we could stand behind. Now, let me just give you a very brief overview of the results that we find here. So in our sample, we have somehow Okay, so shy of 1 million, so 900,000 deaths, and this results in a total of close to 15 million years of life lost. And the relative impact of COVID with respect to, in this case, the flu I have selected is 2 to 7 times the years of life lost of an average influenza season. The age distribution, as I mentioned before, is such that only about a fourth in the entire sample, only about a fourth of the years of life lost come from the older age groups, and a substantial amount come from the younger age group, under 55, about a third of them. This is especially true for mid and low income countries, but I'll be showing you that in detail. And finally, we find that the men have lost substantially more years of life lost than women. Now, just a brief comment on the methodology. So as most of you know, the YLL methodology is perhaps one of the most well-known exponents of these sort of exercises, the global burden of disease study. Now, in general, we compute years of life lost as the difference between the life expectancy at the age at which a given person has died, in this case due to COVID-19. Now, what are the deviations that we have with respect to the exercise that you all know, the global burden of disease? Well, we use country-specific life tables instead of a best practice life table, and we use country-specific as well age structures and not a standard population. And the reason why we do that is because we're not interested in measuring trends towards certain goals, aspirational goals, but rather we want to have a snapshot of what the impact of the pandemic has been in today in the countries that we study. Now, regarding the excess mortality calculations, we know that those are important, given that there has been substantial undercounting of deaths, especially during the first wave of the pandemic. So what we did here is we took advantage of the, at the time, newly released data set on weekly all-cause mortality, and we estimated a mortality baseline and computed the excess mortality in the usual manner for the months for which COVID was active. Now, I have already talked a lot about the data sources. Those are the ones that I have already mentioned. Then we use world population prospects for both life expectancy and age structures. And finally, we use death counts for the other causes we would be comparing COVID-19 to from the global burden of disease. Now, obviously, they use their years of life loss calculations that are performed differently in the way that I have mentioned. And what we will do here is we will recomputing all the years of life lost using the death that they attribute to those causes, but not their years of life lost outcomes. Now, let me just go to the results directly. So what you see here in the x-axis are simply the countries, and on the y-axis you see the ratio of years of life lost due to COVID-19 versus, in this case, seasonal influenza. Hence, for instance, if we pick the first row, Italy, we see that COVID-19 has resulted in between 6 to 7 more years of life lost than the average seasonal influenza season. Now, we know that influenza seasons vary by country and by years, so some are worse, some are better. So what we did here to account for that is we compared them to both the median influenza year and the maximum influenza year. And the way we computed this median influenza year is we computed for the last 30 years of data, the years of life lost to influenza, picked up the median year, and then did the same and picked up the maximum maximum year. And this is the comparison that you see here. Now, we have ordered these countries by the size of the impact in terms of years of life lost due to COVID. And what you find in those countries that we all know, and you can see it here, that having heavily impacted the current pandemic has resulted in far more years of life lost than influenza, no matter whether you pick the bad influenza years or the good influenza years or the average influenza years, it's simply much worse. On average, in the sample, it is true that it's about the same as an average global, let's say this way, influenza year, but this is just a composition of some countries not being very heavily impacted. Now, another comparison, we have some more in the paper, but I have selected just a few, not to overstay my welcome. Another comparison that we may make is that to heart diseases. So we know in the developed world, heart diseases are the leading cause of years of life lost. And so in our mind, it made sense to compare it to something that is perhaps of a similar size and something which is, we know, a leading cause. Now, compared to heart diseases, then in the vast majority of countries, COVID is below the years of life lost. So we have an average of about 20%, but in heavily impacted countries, it's about half of the years of life lost to heart diseases. Now, there are some outliers like Peru here, but in general, it is below. Now, what you have to remember here is that these calculations are done with official death counts. They're not done with excess mortality, with the death that we might compute using excess mortality calculations. So I just wanted to give you now a sense of how that might change the picture that we're seeing here, because so far, yes, it seems that the pandemic has a substantial impact. It's much worse than a flu, and it is not as bad as heart diseases, but not that far behind. But how would that change if we included the deaths that may have been undercounted? So what we do here is we compare the years of life lost due to official death counts for COVID-19 to the years of life lost that could result if we attributed all excess mortality, and I'll come back to that in the discussion, if we attributed all excess mortality that we have estimated for the period to COVID-19. Now, we know this might not be true, but it gives you a sense of the overall impact of the pandemic at the very least, even if you don't believe that all of it is COVID-19. Now, if we do that, we find that there is severe undercounting for certain countries and not so much for others. So there is a wide variety on how much the official death counts are capturing the full story for years of life lost. So on average, although you can see, I'm not hiding it from you, you can see that there is a wide spread. On average, we're undercounting years of life lost by about half. So if you come back here or to the other plot, if you were to double this, you can see how the ratios might look quite different. So it might actually be much worse than what I have shown you, but to know that, we'll have to wait until we have definitive calculations on excess mortality and the actual death counts to COVID-19. Now, just to finish up on the results, I'm gonna give you a breakdown by age and by gender. So what you're seeing here again on the x-axis are the different countries. On the y-axis, you're seeing the proportion of years of life lost attributed to 3 age groups. I apologize if the plot is a little bit small. It was hard to fit in the page. The 3 age groups that we consider is up to 55 years old, from 55 years old to 75 years old, and from 75 years old onwards. And what you see here is that for high-income countries— 2
more minutes.
Okay, I'll be fast. So for high-income countries, we see that about half of the years of life lost can be attributed to the older age group, but only half. And as we move towards lower and mid-income countries, the younger age groups gain in importance. Now, we cannot find such a say, consistent explanation for the results on gender. So it is true that in all the countries in our sample, men are losing more years of life than women, but the extent to which this is true varies a lot by country, and we don't find any obvious explanation for that. Now, just as a brief conclusion, this is not about flu, it's much worse, at least in the places that have been heavily impacted. The possible real impact is much higher if we account for excess mortality. The years of life lost are not only for the oldest groups, and men are more affected. Now, in just very, very briefly, in terms of next steps, I have already said excess mortality right now is a catch-all. Here we have excess mortality that could be attributed to COVID. Maybe there are other causes. Well, in fact, we know that other causes have also changed throughout the pandemic. So we may need to be a bit more careful on how we do this. We also know that there are significant or important sequels to COVID. And obviously, when we do a true account of the impact of the pandemic, we'll have to account for disability. And we do think that years of life lost provide a nice framework. Maybe policy evaluations could be done not only in terms of death, but also in terms of years of life lost. Thank you very much.